Today we're going to take a look at the Ottomans in this period of empires and collision. To kind of simplify it, the Ottomans were vigorous and expansive for about the first 300 years of their existence, but the last 300 years they were in a slow decline. But still by 1750 they were considered the strong sword of Islam, which basically meant they defended Islamic peoples throughout North Africa and the Middle East. They were seen as really the most powerful Islamic state and often came to their aid. So it was kind of a source of pride that the Ottomans carried for the rest of Islam. But they had begun to lose land to European powers, Christian European powers, which made it kind of even more degrading. Russia had been expanding southward into the Black Sea region. It really began with Peter the Great, but saw more success under Catherine the Great. And slowly, the Ottomans lost more of the Caucasus and the Crimea region to Russia. France, Britain, and Austria, well, France and Britain, they were more concerned with areas like, for instance, North Africa. France would be Morocco, Algeria. Britain would be more Egypt. In Austria, we talked about them with the Franco-Prussian War, how they were blocked by the German state, the new emerging Germany in Central Europe. So Austria began to look southeastward into the Balkans, which the Ottomans had dominated for the last couple centuries. So Austria began carving out areas, for instance, like Bosnia and that region. And as I mentioned, they were unable to defend Muslims elsewhere as Europeans pushed into, say, the Middle East and North Africa. The Ottomans were really powerless to stop them. Now you had a changing global economic order. In fact, the Ottoman economy was based upon skilled craftsmen, but they were losing out on much of the world market to cheaper produced European goods. Plus, we talked about the Age of Discovery and how global trade now circumvented the Ottomans and no longer had to go through Constantinople. And so they lost a lot of their economic importance. Here you see lands lost in different time periods. And you can see that much of North Africa was gone, and much of really the Balkan Peninsula was gone by this time period. So it's starting to decrease. Now the Ottomans weren't blind. They knew they had to make certain changes, but as in any society, you've got your hardcore conservatives that are basically, why do we need to change? We have a perfect society. What we need to do is kind of refocus on what made us so great to begin with. And then you got the others, it's like, look, change is inevitable. We need to adopt what we want. Listen, this is all going to come into play again when we talk about Japan. Though the conservatives in the Ottoman empires were strictly more along religious lines. Keep in mind, Wahhabism, which we talked about before, began in what today is Saudi Arabia. Though the Ottomans would try to crush Wahhabism, they still had their own mullahs, their own religious leaders that tried to kind of restrict the reforms. Now, it really began with certain sultans who kind of admired Napoleon. They saw what the French army did. In fact, the Ottomans came in conflict with Napoleon as he tried to break out of Egypt. If you remember, before he became emperor, the Directorate sent him to Egypt to try to win that area from British control. And he got stuck there when his fleet was sunk. But anyway, the point here is that the sultans saw this professional army that Napoleon created, and he began to import Western advisors, especially after the fall of Napoleon. And what he saw was his army was way too archaic. Specifically, the Janissaries had grown too powerful. So he tried to lessen their power. Well, the Janissaries killed him. Well, the next sultan came and the first thing he did is slaughter the Janissaries. So imagine the Ottomans getting rid of one of their most powerful military establishments. And they began to bring in as I said, advisors to build a new Western-oriented army. Now the Turks, the Ottomans, begin looking to this new German state, and they're going to develop very close ties, first with Prussia, and then later the German Reich, the German Empire. So they began importing the advisors and even the weaponry that they used. And many people, especially like, for instance, the aristocratic horsemen of the Ottoman armies, didn't like this, and didn't like the way the changes were occurring. About 1870, the Sultan began to push the Tanzimat reforms. This was an era of many different changes. The Tanzimat reforms didn't take place in one year. They took place over a couple decades, and they eventually culminated in like an 1876 constitution that granted wider rights. One of the rights it granted was more input for religious minorities. Keep in mind, the Ottoman is a multi-ethnic empire, and many of its subjects were various forms of Christian, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox. And so this led to, for instance, a constitution that protected minority rights, called for the establishment of a parliament, and had more freedom of the press. Unfortunately, after only 2 years, a kind of ultra-conservative sultan by the name of Abdul Hamid came to power, and he did not like these changes. There was too much outspokenness in the press and in society. So he canceled the Tanzimat reforms, really, in the Constitution, and he suppressed a lot of the freedom of speech and press. And this led to a group known as the Ottoman Society for Union and Progress, who were always called the Young Ottomans and later the Young Turks. They were driven into exile, mostly to Paris, where they continued publishing their material wanting the restoration of the Constitution that was created during the Tanzimat reforms. And in this way, they slowly kind of infiltrated their ideas back into the Ottoman Empire. So, in the end, the Sultan was turned into more of a religious figurehead, and the Young Turks did assume power. Although the Young Turks, they did not want to give up the Ottoman Empire. They were Ottoman nationalists at the core, and though they wanted changes that were more Western oriented, they were unwilling to release many of their states, which really was their undoing, because it got them involved in many wars, including the Balkan Wars, as you started to see nations arise. First Greece in 1820, who even today is an enemy of the Turks, but Bulgaria, Romania, many of these were due to a concept I want you to know. It's called Pan-Slavism. Pan-Slavism is the union of Slavic people, really under Russian domination. You see, the Russians, the Bulgarians, the Serbians, even Greeks are Slavic people. And they share really the same culture and the same religion, being Eastern Orthodox. And so Russia would kind of put themselves in the role as big brother Slavs to all the little brother Slavs. So they continually would back, for instance, Bulgarian or even Romanian independence from the Ottoman Empire. And of course, the Ottoman or the Young Turk nationalism would get the Ottomans involved in World War I, which would eventually be their undoing. Eventually, after World War I, you'd get Mustafa Kemal in power, and he would create the modern nation of Turkey. But we're not into Mustafa. So these are all Young Turks, and you can see them embracing more Western style reforms. So for instance, in the one picture you got Lady Liberty flying over, showing like the Constitution that was created. So that's what that's all about. And we'll stop with